If you're shooting B-roll in 2026, there's a good chance you're defaulting to 60 frames per second. And it's the reason your footage looks like everybody else's. Every time you hit 60, you're throwing away half your story, the audio. I'm a documentary director and DP. I've shot for PBS, ESPN, and Discovery Channel, and I stopped defaulting to 60 frames per second a long time ago. This video is for anyone who's ever hit 60 frames per second without asking why. Here's how we're gonna break this down. 4 levels. Level 1, the crutch. Level 2, what you lose. Level 3, the mindset shift. And level 4, the framework. And at the end, I'm gonna tell you about one of my favorite frame rates that's between 24 and 60 that almost nobody's talking about. What's going on, world? I'm Eric D. Seals, and today we're talking about why I stopped defaulting to 60 frames per second on my work and what I shoot instead. I have the opportunity to hire other people on a regular basis, and I've reviewed hundreds of reels, and some of them are wall-to-wall slow motion, which tells you nothing about the storytelling ability. 60 frames per second has become a default instead of a choice. This applies to documentaries, wedding, corporate, YouTube, anyone filming any type of B-roll or any type of scene. If your reel is 90% slow-mo, it tells me you don't know what else to do at this point. If you want to make more intentional work, not just pretty slow-mo shots, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. So I've reviewed hundreds of reels, and when everything is slow motion, it doesn't make you look more cinematic. It makes you look like you don't know what else to do. When every clip is slow-mo, nothing stands out. Slow-mo has become the easy button for mediocre footage. The real skill is telling a story at real speed. 60 frames per second isn't bad, it just shouldn't be the default, and that's the problem. When's the last time you made a deliberate frame rate choice before you hit record? If you can't answer that, you've been defaulting, and that default is costing you more than you think. That's the crutch. But there's a bigger cost, and it has nothing to do with how your footage looks. It's about what you can't hear. Everyone talks about 60 frames per second and what it gives you, but nobody talks about what it takes away. When you film in 60, you lose audio. And in documentary, audio is half of the story, if not more. Now, obviously there's a way to film in a frame rate and then, change it up in post, but even then, it's something that not a lot of people do in post-production, and it just adds more work to the system. The other thing to keep in mind is you lose that natural sound that is coming from your microphone when you're shooting in 60 frames per second. Whether that be the hooves of a horse when you're filming at a rodeo, or the voices of a crowd, the wind, the reactions, all these different things you lose. And yes, you can fake it and add it in post, but it's not the same as having the real sound from the actual B-roll. The other thing to keep in mind is if you ever film in 60, you can't cleanly get it to regular speed. There's no clean number that can divide to get you 23.976 or even 24 frames per second. There is some technology out there that will allow you to get close, but it will always drift over time because it can't stay at that exact frame rate. So that's something you need to keep in mind, because if you ever want that to be at regular speed, you won't really be able to do it in a clean way. So I was working on a project for ESPN. It was called Black Cowboys, and we were following a lot of rodeo people, I guess, roadsters. I don't know, people who ride horses at rodeos. And being in Vegas and the sound and the horses and the bulls and the announcer, you can't replace that. And so I was fighting myself on a regular basis trying to figure out, because I know 60 frames per second can make an image look cool, but then at the same time, I'm losing a lot of that natural documentary sound and essence that I want to capture while we're telling this story. So I was constantly battling myself, going between 23 frames per second or 23.98 and or 24 and 60 frames per second. I knew that we couldn't tell the story with those sounds, but I also knew for the trailer and different look and feels that slow-mo does something that you can't necessarily explain. So I needed something to intentionally get me to a mix of both. Slow-mo should be curated. The less you use it, the more impact it'll have on your film. So the director I was working with for the Black Cowboys project, brought something up that I hadn't heard at the time, and they're like, why don't we film this at 48 frames per second? They did a lot of sports projects previous to this, and that is a speed that they utilize on a regular basis because it gives you the best of both worlds. It allows you to have that slow motion feel, but if for any reason we need to speed it up so that we can use it at regular speed with our audio recordist or our field audio person, we're able to do that. And my mind was just kind of like, I never thought about that, because 48 frames per second does give you a feel that makes it feel a little bit more slower, so to speak, but it's not obviously as slow as 60 frames per second, but it's just exactly what you need. And it's something that I find myself doing on a regular basis, is filming at 48 frames per second, because I can always go back and make it work for the audio, but it also gives me that slow motion feel that I need sometimes. It depends on what camera you use. So for instance, on some cameras, you can change the shooting rate and the frame rate so that you're shooting at 24 frames per second, but then you can take it in post and slow it down to 60 frames per second. Not every camera gives you that capability. I know the A7S III does, my A7 III does. Depending on what camera you have, sometimes you can have the best in both worlds with that scenario, but I know I can't do that on my FX6 or FX9 or some other cameras that I've used, so it's just an important quality to understand. Slow motion should be curated. It should elevate the story, not replace good storytelling. Now I'm gonna give you the 3 questions that will change every frame rate decision you ever make. Here's what I want you to walk away with. Not just stop shooting at 60 frames per second. That's not the purpose of this video. These are the 3 questions that you need to have before every shoot and every time you press record. Question number 1, does this moment need sound? If the answer is yes, 60 is off the table. Wedding vows, interview B-roll, verite, any moment where audio matters. Question number 2, am I slowing it for story or just for the look? It looks cool is not a story reason. Does slowing reveal something that we couldn't see if it was in regular speed? Question number 3, could 48 frames per second give me both? 24 obviously goes into 48 very clean. It allows you to slow down your footage, and there's no crazy math that you need if you need to flip the footage. 60 frames per second still works, especially when you're short on time and you need to film B-roll, when sound doesn't matter, and it's not being used as a default. It's actually helping tell the story, slowing it down at that speed. But most people are just using it just to use it. Unfortunately, most people never figured this out, and they just default to filming everything at 60 frames per second and having no reason why, which makes their footage look mediocre. The 3 questions that I just gave you, that's the framework. Your footage will look different and sound different because your thinking has changed. Because it gives you slow motion when you needed it, and the sound when the story demanded it. And that's what intention sounds like. Amateurs default to 60 and hope it looks cinematic. Professionals choose their frame rate because every choice tells part of the story. So that's just a little tidbit of what I've used in the past when I want the best of both worlds. That's 48 frames per second. Just whatever you do, don't default to 60, and definitely don't utilize 120 too much because it makes your footage look like everybody else's. I'm Eric D. Seals. Do me that one favor, keep telling stories that matter.